You seem different. Untouched by false truths.
It's appropriate that Mortal Shell's trailer tells us we seem different, because when I began to hear about its mechanics, I thought the same thing about you, Mortal Shell. I love Dark Souls and Bloodborne. Love them. The lore, the visceral combat, the atmosphere, it's enough to make a grown man cry when you find a game series like this that seizes you by the throat and tells you, you're going to like this or die trying. And I always like it. Maybe it's the masochist in me. Who knows? Souls-likes, however, often miss the mark for me. I've tried a lot of them too. Lords of the Fallen, the combat's so sluggish I was ready to feed my console some lettuce. Neo, I despised the world and the level design. It felt like a discount FromSoft game. The Surge, I wanted so desperately to love, but again, the world just didn't engage me. I felt like I was fighting through factory after factory for the first 10 hours, and ultimately, I never even finished it. Mortal Shell is the exception. Don't get me wrong, I don't believe Mortal Shell should be explored against the backdrop of Soulsborne games, and I'll try not to do that here. But it's universally accepted by this point that Soulsborne, much like Metroidvania titles, has become a subgenre of fantastical third-person action-adventure games. Film reviewers don't focus their attention on how action scenes are presented in comedy movies, they analyse the laughs. Book reviewers don't analyse the quality of the mystery writing in fantasy titles, they focus on the world building. The Game Maker's Toolkit released an excellent video back in 2017 called Do We Need a Souls-like Genre?, which I will link in the description below because, as I said, it's excellent. But I don't think he's defined enough what exactly makes a Souls-like game, and because Mortal Shell is unabashedly taking from Souls-likes, we'll need to define what components make a Souls-like title before we explore whether or not Mortal Shell achieves what it sets out to do. This will take some time, so if you want to skip ahead to the bit where I actually talk about Mortal Shell, I'll put the timestamp up on screen. Now. No, wait for it. Now. There you go. Haha, made you wait for it. So, here's Monty Zander's handy guide to creating your first Souls-like. I've written this out before playing any of Mortal Shell, so I've got my fingers and toes crossed as the game downloads that it'll make the most of these. TheGamer.com released an article written by Brandon McIntyre titled The Souls-like genre is bad game design, and psh, mate. I would argue that this is a ridiculous claim just written for clicks, but I can barely read it because your website is broken. Why can't I get away from your cookies banner? But one interesting argument Brandon makes is that a Souls-like's difficulty doesn't truly tutorialize their mechanics to the player. You're thrown to the wolves, as he says, and I would disagree with that. You just need to look at my Bloodborne video to see how the game teaches you everything you need to know in the first few hours. No, a Souls-like's difficulty comes from its firm but fair nature. High difficulty is too broad a term to define a Souls-like. Cuphead is hard as hell and that's not a Souls-like, so what exactly is it that enacts this firm but fairness which fans of the games love so much? Well, two things. Resource management and pattern reading. The first to focus on is pattern reading. Enemies in a Souls-like should telegraph their moves. There should be patterns for us to read. An illusion of randomness is okay, but after trying and dying and trying again, we should ultimately get a fair feel for an enemy's attack strategy, be that bosses or standard grunts. In Dark Souls, we and the enemies are slower in our attacks, so they're easier to read. In Sekiro or Bloodborne, we and they are much faster, so we need to dial up our focus and concentration, but the patterns are always there. The second component for difficulty is resource management. Are the resources given to us in the game too plentiful? Not plentiful enough? A Souls-like doesn't need, say, Estus Flask, which refills after death, but it does need a healing system which we have to use manually. I can't think of a single Souls-like which has regenerating health as a base mechanic. Do let me know if I've missed one. We also have to manage our stamina or mana bar as well, statistically examining every encounter to ensure we don't tire ourselves out when in the fray of battle. Alongside resource management, we need to ask what we lose when dying. What are we punished with? A Souls-like game doesn't just reset you to your checkpoint and that's the end of it. We're often robbed of something as penance for our death. Often it's our XP points or currency of some kind, souls, blood echoes, scraps, etc. How is this handled in your Souls-like? Our fourth key asset is of course the level design. The world of a Souls-like often feels lived in. Often we stumble across this land after the real story has already happened. For example, we don't play Dark Souls 1 during Gwyn's time. In The Surge, we don't experience the uprising of robots in Jericho City. By the time we arrive, things have already gone horribly wrong. This doesn't need to be the case for a Souls-like to be a Souls-like, but it's a common narrative thread. What is key for the genre, however, is sprawling, lengthy areas which loops back into itself through shortcuts. The world design should be ingrained in our thoughts by the time we complete this game, if it's done its job right. The final component, I would argue, is hands-off storytelling. Cutscenes are great, make them look beautiful, do all you like, but lengthy cutscenes where characters discuss what's happening and what they need to do are very, very rare. Sekiro got away with this, just barely.
I've come to free you.
I don't care. I don't care! Often the lore of these worlds is fully realised through environmental storytelling. For example, Anor Londo tells us everything we need to know about Gwyn's kingdom. The gigantic structures, the highly skilled knights, the gorgeous golden light stolen from us when we destroy the illusion. If Mortal Shell can create moments even close to this, I'll be a happy bunny. So, without further ado, let's get into the game itself. The first thing which will strike you about Mortal Shell is the loading screens. Yeah, I know, not exactly the most riveting stuff to open with, but we do need to acknowledge how heinous these things truly are. For a game which is 15-ish hours and isn't constantly chugging away to load in vast skyboxes or a customized character, it is pretty monotonous sitting through this damn thing every time you die. Now, I played Mortal Shell on a basic PS4, not a Pro or a PC, so maybe the loading times aren't as much of an issue here, but for me, this did kill some of my initial hype as my finger wedged into the start button. Why am I commenting on something as basic as this in a critique? Well, it's to highlight something pretty important going forwards. Mortal Shell was developed by Cold Symmetry, a team of 15 over the course of 3 years. It was originally going to be called Dungeon Haven. Not much information about what Dungeon Haven was originally intended to be is out there, but the basic concept was that you were a warrior of some kind, resurrected by a sentient dungeon, which would send you out on your quest. Mortal Shell sells, try saying that 5 times fast, for £25 in the UK, and joins the likes of Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice in the pantheon of AA video games, which we've seen peek out from behind office cabinets in the past couple of years. It is important to say that while I will make note of things like the incessantly long loading screens, I don't think these diminish the game's final impact too much because, as I said, it's a passion project built by a team and released for half of what, say, Lords of the Fallen's price was. It doesn't mean I'm going to go easy on the game, far from it. There are some things which really bother me and hopefully will be fixed in a patch or a sequel, but price did play a factor in my impressions of the game. Mortal Shell provides so much value and depth that I would happily have paid full price for the experience that I got. Taking the words from the horse's mouth, the dev's website reads, "Produced by a core team of just 15 people, Mortal Shell was only made possible due to the team's pedigree and burning desire to honour the painful majesty of the genre." That phrase, painful majesty of the genre, is really interesting to me, and it's the main reason why, as we explore the game further, we'll reference Mortal Shell's effectiveness in using the Souls-like components previously outlined. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's awaken our meat sack. We awaken in a pool of cold, black water. Our form is grey, tall and broad, of course keeping in step with the stone motif that will often appear throughout our journey. We are the empty vessel. Marching through a few simple tutorial messages, we feel a real heft to how our character moves. Controls feel as tight and responsive as they do in From Software games. Every action has a gravitas to it. When we dodge, our feet plant firmly in the ground before dashing away, meaning there's a split-second pause before escaping an enemy's attacks, something a little tricky to watch out for when we'll come up against enemies later. I feel that Brandon McIntyre would appreciate the hand-holding we do experience in the game's opening 10 minutes. Mortal Shell isn't afraid to tutorialise our opening moments, using our first boss, Hadern, get it, to pause the screen and slap us with the game's basic mechanic: harden. See, with Mortal Shell, dodging is possible and yes, should be part of your strategy, but the game's core mechanic is all about this ability to harden your skin to prevent damage during combat. If timed right, we can use this as a parry mechanic. If we were thinking about it simplistically, a comparison could be drawn between this and shield mechanics in other Souls-likes.
You see, I just pressed the L2 button and raised my shield and absorbed the blows. Easy.
No! That's wrong!
Oh.
The hardening your skin isn't really the end of it. Timing is everything in Mortal Shell. We can use Harden to lessen damage, to regain health, to stagger an enemy, or combine it into our attack sequences. It's a mechanic which looks as deep as a puddle, until you fall into it. Hadern is the guardian of Mortal Shell's weapons. He can use Harden just like us, which makes him an effective tutorial fight. Just like all the great tutorial bosses, it shows us what we could become if we just put our minds to it, while also hammering some of the core concepts home. We also only get one chance to fight him at the start. If Hadern kills you, the empty vessel goes down and does not get back up. Don't worry though, we get a few other chances to exact our revenge against this guy, as if we want to unlock the rest of the weapons Mortal Shell has to offer, we need to best him in combat whilst he wields that very weapon. I love this. By the end of the game, Hadern wasn't an enemy anymore, he was my sparring partner. Using him to better my skills against a humanoid enemy just like myself, wielding a weapon which made me excited to use it. When we finally faced off for the hammer and chisel, I felt like I was greeting an old friend as he marched through the fog towards me. If you beat him, you receive a glimpse of Reverie, an item which we ultimately will use to level up our abilities later, but for now, Hadern's sword buries itself in our neck and we hit the deck. The wormfish swims beneath us and swallows us whole, which raises the question of how are we able to stand on this gigantic pool of water if the fish can swim below us? I haven't found any lore answers for this yet, so let me know if you have any theories below. When we awaken, we're forced to climb through this lengthy tunnel and emerge into our first real area, Fulgrim. It's hard not to see the stark similarities to the first Dark Souls in much of the level design in the first 2/3 of this game. This green woodland area waits ahead of us. Statues, and those of you who've watched my Bloodborne video know I love my in-game statues, are waiting either side, reading from scripture of some sort. If we turn around, we see a huge skeletal form. It might be due to our fleshy nature, but symbolically, I felt that by climbing up and through this creature, the game had birthed us into this world after the tutorial, which is apt, as we're as vulnerable in our current state as a newborn. It isn't until we've marched forwards and find our first Mortal Shell
That's why they call it that.
that we realise just how character progression will be used throughout the game. We aren't creating a customised character at any point. Every player will start off in the same place with the same stats and the same abilities. The game then provides us with our first hero to embody, and it's this hero which we will level up, wearing them like some magical muscle suit. Haros the Vassal is the first hero we'll inhabit. You'll notice a common theme as we pick up the other heroes throughout our journey. They each have titles. A vassal is someone who has pledged allegiance to a king or lord, but even after completing the game twice, I admit I'm not an adept enough lore hunter to learn much more about him. Despite his name giving a sense of nobility, what we do know is Haros was anything but noble.
The madman, I would come to realize, was not burdened with delusions, but truth. Yet the wary ear corrupts honest words into lies. I took him for a spy and cut him down. How else could he know so much about me? He had condemned himself with each utterance.
He would cut down his enemies first and ask questions later. Mortal Shell's voice acting is a cut above what we normally see in Souls-likes. I would go so far as to say that it's of a higher quality than the Dark Souls games. Gone is the expected monotone delivery of characters who have lost their minds. The characters in Mortal Shell are mysterious, yes, but still very conscious of the situation they find themselves in. A perfect example would, in fact, be Sester Janessa, our bonfire waifu.
You've kept me waiting, foundling. Do not worry. 'Tis only a jest.
Janessa is a riot. For the first time, I found myself chuckling and being interested in the character of the archetypal level-up lady that's such a staple in Soulsborne games. Even if her greatest personality trait is just being really, really thirsty.
Would it please your withered lips to taste my gifts once again?
She marks our checkpoints throughout the world and allows us to strengthen the shells that we wear. We only know safety is near when we see her spectral frame shimmering in the darkness. She greets us and immediately calls us a foundling, presumably because we're an empty vessel which finds bodies to wear. Whenever we found a shell, it's really exciting to find her again and learn the names of the individual heroes we'll inhabit, especially if you didn't play the beta and went in blind, like me. We have to collect tar and glimpses on our quest, and of course we lose them when we die and have to regain them from our old body. Using these with Janessa to strengthen our heroes, Mortal Shell takes a unique approach, more akin to Sekiro than Bloodborne. We don't level up our HP or stamina bar. Instead, we unlock new abilities for our heroes, be it a powerful kick or the chance for enemies to drop glimpses when battling them. I commend Cold Symmetry for trying something different in their leveling up, and the system absolutely makes sense to complement the 4 unique classes we need to use, but this is going to be hard to say. I don't think the system, as it is, works like Cold Symmetry thinks it does. Some of these upgrades you can unlock are kind of crappy, and not even worth the effort. And the kick function is so key to maneuvering shielded enemies that I feel it should be in our repertoire from the get-go. Also, whilst glimpses and tar are hardly rare resources, I feel upgrading Haros is a complete waste of time and energy because he's clearly so much weaker than the other heroes. He's supposed to be the most balanced hero, but he's just not. Not really. Solomon the Scholar is. Look at the screen. Haros only has 5 points of durability, 5 points of stamina, and 5 points of resolve. Comparing it with Solomon's, 7 durability, 5 stamina, 10 resolve. Why would you ever go back to using Haros once you've unlocked Solomon? It's not a deal breaker, but it's definitely worth mentioning, especially if you haven't played the game yet and are looking to pick it up yourself. The tower which Janessa lives in will essentially act as our hub safe zone for the rest of the game, where a few useful NPCs will gather and we can change our shells and weapons at will. The tower isn't particularly interesting as a location, it's really just a grassy mound that lives near a bog, but the character designs are complex enough that I greatly enjoy the NPCs that pop up. Oh look, here's one now. Vlas is our primary merchant, and this camp queen and his black cat, which you can pet by the way, provides some much needed levity after hacking our way through brigands and dealing with the steep learning curve of learning how to harden ourselves. I love this guy.
You must be a gentleman. Certainly not one of those boorish fanatics. Welcome then. I'll warp some tea.
Climbing the stairs, we cross the Dark Father, a gigantic figure collapsed in the side of the tower with a beak-like helmet. You might recognise the deep, booming voice from the trailer. His job is to give us a parry mechanic.
Praise the parry!
And a request. Journey to some dungeons, collect glands from bosses, and return them to him. Crossing the bog, we come across our first official boss of the game, Grishna. Those of you who watched some of the beta gameplay may have a bell or two ringing at the name. Yes, this boss is the same kind of creature as the Enslaved Grishner we saw in that earlier footage, just this one doesn't have a metal cage on its head and it's ultimately less aggressive. The Grishna is an okay first boss. It's not exactly a cleric beast or an asylum demon. It takes more from the Jedi Fallen Order camp of boss fights, where they've given a standard looking creature with no lore behind it a large health pool and called it a boss, but it's a good test of everything we've learned so far. It's big enough that it seems imposing when you first cross it, and it packs a punch in its attacks. Just like most bosses you'll face in your journey, and best of all, you can parry it.
Praise the parry!
While I figure all of this out and die to the Grishna, this is a good opportunity for me to talk about Mortal Shell's combat. There's a lot to unpack here, so consider this a simple part 1. We'll return to it later. For now, note the weight of the weapons I'm using. With the exception of the hammer and chisel, all of your attacks in Mortal Shell will be slow and laboured, and this is where the steepest learning curve comes from. See, the enemy's attacks are often fast, and the windows between their attacks, whilst common, aren't particularly wide. We're averaging about 2 seconds between attack for the Grishna, and it has a couple of really cheap moves like elbowing you in the side of the noggin when it pulls its claws out of the mud. As a result, it's going to take some time to really get used to how greedy you can truly be in Mortal Shell. Each battle is a marathon, not a sprint. It's about taking in the situation, reading the boss's pattern, and being aware that you can't be too aggressive in your attacks, especially because Cold Symmetry were so damn stingy with the stamina bar for 3 out of your 4 heroes to force you into using the hardened system. I hated this at first. I did. I swore a lot during this fight and swore blind that the hardened system was broken and unfair. I know, got my ass kicked by the first boss and yet here I am writing a critique praising the game, but it's true. Just like the classic Souls games, I often don't fully appreciate it until I've stepped away and feel its hooks in me. Mortal Shell requires you to engage with all of its systems, not just one of them, and some players might hate that. You won't be able to get through the whole game with your sanity intact unless you learn exactly how to make the best use of Harden, understand you need to be patient, engage with the consumables that enhance your strategy, and above all else, parry. God damn it, parry.
Praise the parry!
See, parrying in this game isn't as simple as just tapping a button and that's the end of it. You have a rune which flashes red when an enemy uses a move which can't be parried. I appreciate the visual clue, but god, I wish it flashed red when I could parry instead. The amount of rewiring my brain had to do to not instinctively slam my finger down when I saw that little red beacon of hope light up took me longer than I care to admit. Parrying also has a weight in Mortal Shell. There's a good beat between you pressing the button and your character actually parrying. Because of this, you can't rely on instincts. You need to watch your enemy and eke out the strategy before you can confidently go in. Because parrying is one of the few ways the game allows you to regain health mid-fight. God knows you can't rely on consumables, which we will get to. See why I said we'd have to discuss this later? Defeating the Grishna, my fists raised in the air and my yells nearly making my neighbours call the police, were able to unlock the second hero we previously discussed, Solomon the Scholar, particularly suited if you've become best friends with the Resolve and Harden systems like I did. I feel Cold Symmetry love him the most out of all of the heroes. They released a character trailer for him on the day of the game's release, and he's the brother of the Dark Father who gave us our task to start off with. Facing him while wearing Solomon's shell leaves for a really touching moment, and this is as good a place as any to move on to our first dungeon.
He always had too much to say, babbling on and on, incessantly.
Dark Souls 1 has Lost Izalith, Dark Souls 2 has the Iron Keep, Dark Souls 3 has the Demon Ruins. Maybe it's just me, but something keeps not working about fire areas in games like these. Once you've beaten the Grishna, this is really when the game truly begins. Mortal Shell officially opens up and doesn't hold your hand from this point on. Just go, explore Fulgrim, find these dungeons, do it in any order you want.
Oh, like Dark Souls?
No! Not like Dark Souls. Well, kinda like Dark Souls. But the difference with Mortal Shell is when it tells you to go in any direction you want, it actually means it. We can do these dungeons in any order we want. I don't think I know anybody in their first time through which played Dark Souls and got to the Tomb of the Giants. You couldn't. It's just too hard for such a low-level player. If you did, by all means please comment below and tell me, but I'll be taking your comment with a huge pinch of salt. With Mortal Shell, you should be able to solve any of the dungeons in any random order. The game believes you could, arguably, complete each dungeon with just Harros using the Hallowed Sword. This is true. See, the point isn't that you've leveled up your character, but that the game has conditioned you into simply being a better player. However, it doesn't do this like other Souls-likes. Mortal Shell is punishingly difficult, just like a typical Souls-like, but because the game is trying to throw you up a Sekiro-esque difficulty curve in 15 hours rather than 30, it has to drag you up that curve quickly. For players like myself, where it takes a bit of time to fully absorb complex mechanics, this will hurt. A lot. And nowhere is that clearer than our first dungeon, the Shrine of Ash. Having a brief glance at a couple of walkthroughs and wikis, it seems that there's a common consensus for which order a new player should do the dungeons in. Not because one dungeon is ostensibly harder than another, but because the different challenges each dungeon presents condition you to be prepared for the next one. I'd argue it's psychological. Realistically, if you can get through the Shrine of Ash without breaking your controller, you can beat the rest of the game. Because the Shrine of Ash sucks. I'm sorry, but it does. It's a poorly designed part of the game. I don't know what Cold Symmetry was smoking when they dreamt up this infuriating maze of ambushes together, but it's the worst part of the game by far. At the start of the dungeon, we're met with a new weapon, the Smoldering Mace. Meaning we need to go toe-to-toe with Hadern again, calmly waiting for us in his wee, foggy bath. Defeating him unlocks our second of 4 weapons, and I like the idea of the mace, but the problem is it's simply too slow for what awaits. If the mace's swing speed was just a little bit faster, it would be much more useful here, but unfortunately in its current state, it doesn't work when you're being swarmed by enemies. If I'm going to be limited by a slow swing, I'd at least rather use the Hallowed Sword, because I know it's strong, and I have the ability to cleave down an enemy with the special spear attack I unlocked previously. The Shrine of Ash funnels us into tight corridors with enemies hiding, docile, ready to ambush, and again, if we're playing as 3/4 of the classes we can unlock, we're simply too slow and our stamina is too limited to fight these enemies. This doesn't allow for much player agency here either. If you want to tank through the Shrine of Ash, you're still going to get swarmed by these Nosferatu-looking buggers while trying to face off against the much stronger shield enemies. Honestly, cutting out like 10% of the enemies from this dungeon would make it much more enjoyable. In direct contrast to what we found when exploring Fulgrim, the enemies don't seem to have any reason to be here. Often they just materialise as a royal pain in the arse by slamming you into a wall. The fat, burning enemies sitting in the cauldrons blast shots of lava, presumably from their buttholes, which impact you for a huge damage, and often you'll get trapped between 2 choices, dodging away from them into an ambush, or hardening to absorb the blow, just so you can be ambushed. Thank God there are 2 shortcuts here as well. The level design loops in on itself, just the way we all enjoy, going for the simple route of finding door which is locked from the other side, and then unlocking it by pushing it. Typical. As with the rest of Mortal Shell, we won't be finding any elevators or doors which surprise us with a big level design reveal like Yusefka's Clinic in Bloodborne, but the shortcuts are consistent enough that Mortal Shell reminds me more of Demon Souls than anything else in its level design. Each dungeon being reminiscent of the different worlds of that game, with shortcuts littered throughout each level. It does mean that Mortal Shell's world doesn't have that clear illusion of being a living, breathing space, but again, because the team is so small and they were working on a limited budget, I can forgive it. There are shortcuts here. That's all I need for a game of this size. I do also appreciate the aesthetic here as well. Again, I'm not a lore hunter, and I can't wait to see what other channels like Vati and Hawkshaw come up with after they dig into the intricacies presented, but lore-wise, it seems to be pretty important. We find Iron Maidens, a couple of cages, and dusty ruins. As Mortal Shell uses memory as a motif, the fat cauldron babies could possibly be reliving some sort of torture, so I theorise that the Shrine of Ash seems to have once been a sacred place, which was then converted into a torture chamber, perhaps where Imrod, the dungeon's boss, worked. We even find a curious piece of information about him halfway through. It reads, "Stricken with all of the ills that consumed his kin, Imrod, last of the dragged himself before the immolation. He witnessed, as you will one day, the consecrated living flame, always becoming, always feeding, as its form flakes away in torrents of ash. I know I might be in the minority, but I think Imrod the Unrepentant is one of the best bosses in the game. The reason for this is really quite simple. He's slow and he hits hard, and I think it's in fights like these that Mortal Shell's mechanics shine the most. Entering the Sanctum of Flame, we find ourselves in this open Colosseum-like space. Perhaps Imrod tortured slaves and forced them to fight for entertainment? I'm not sure, but approaching him was like a breath of, "Oh god, he's coming!" Whew. Imrod's design is grotesque. He's almost orcish in his gait. His flabby form looks mutated, and he reminded me, surprisingly, of Vlas, our friendly merchant, though don't tell him I said that. I'm not sure if these two are related or perhaps from the same race of creatures, but one thing's for certain, I won't be messing with Vlas after going toe-to-toe with Imrod. Taking Imrod down, one of my favourite classic Souls-like tricks happens. Yes! Oh yeah. Suck it. Suck it! Take that, you No, no, no! Oh shit. I love when a boss tricks you into thinking you've won before picking itself back up, dusting itself down, and coming at you with extra gusto. One slight disappointment is that the only thing Imrod brings to the table for his second phase is that he kicks now, I guess? Anyway, defeating him, we return to the Shrine of Ash and receive our fiery gland, and that's when everything goes wrong. Clearly, we've pissed something off by stealing this. Nobody warned us this would happen. Not the Dark Father, not even our honeybun Janessa, but the old enemies have disappeared and are now replaced by wraiths which rush you. Thankfully, we've unlocked a straightforward shortcut back to the entrance to the dungeon, so getting out isn't much of an issue, but again, as I exited the dungeon, it became even more apparent to me that this was a level in a game I was playing, not a living, breathing space that once existed in this world. Exiting back to Fulgrim, more bad news awaits us, and this was the moment when, despite its failings, I loved Mortal Shell. A ghastly fog has covered the land. I was so looking forward to getting back to Fulgrim's quaint bandit camps and dumb poisonous frogs after the hellish tunnels of the Shrine of Ash, and when I realised that the world was now wrong somehow, I was filled with dread. To use another Souls reference, despite saying I'd try to avoid them, there was a pit in my stomach very similar to when I found Dark Souls 1's dead bonfire at Firelink Shrine. Taking a deep breath, I pushed on to the next dungeon. The Crypt of Martyrs is my favourite dungeon of the three. I love how labyrinthian this feels, and even though we have to work through some catacombs to get to an ice palace, I don't feel like the enemies ambush you so easily in these tight corridors. The crypt is teeming with history. Screaming statues are sucked into the walls. The darkness is oppressive, with strange open coffins carrying these bizarre skeletons with human tops but long tails. I can only guess that they're the remnants of whatever these irritating creatures are. Pushing through into the Ice Palace and finding the journal entries by the first martyr plants a couple of curiosity seeds to whet our appetite before dancing with this dungeon's boss, Tarsus. Perhaps it's because I'd leveled up my character, or because I'd unlocked Aerodrum's shell beforehand, but I wasn't half as annoyed journeying underground as I was in the Shrine of Ash. Before we enter the catacombs though, we have to face off against Hadern once again to earn ourselves a new weapon, just like last time. Battling Hadern, even though he has a new moveset with this new weapon, gives a real sense of growth to the player. I managed to beat him this time without dying once, whereas the first real fight with him in the Shrine of Ash knocked me on my arse more times than I'd care to admit. It's a shame then that the sword we unlock from him is basically just a slower, more cumbersome version of the hallowed sword we had from the beginning. I don't know if there's a purpose to this, or if the devs were just mocking the player with where they placed the weapons, but just like the mace not being as effective as it could have been in the Shrine of Ash, the Martyr's blade is simply too long and lethargic to protect you in the catacombs. Fast lurkers are waiting in tight corridors and passageways, ready to leap out and devour you, and using any weapon slower than the hallowed sword in here just feels like you're begging these fanged furries to chomp on your face. I have a particular adoration for the sinister humanoid creatures which rip knives out of themselves to throw at you before just giving in at 75% health and kamikazing you with a poisonous head-shaped football. They're so creepy and give off just enough of a challenge that fighting 2 of these at once feels just like a challenge, rather than a headache. As we tiptoe our way to the next boss, let's take this opportunity to talk about how Mortal Shell handles death. Mortal Shell's death system is probably the most interesting thing about the shell mechanic. Essentially, your health bar is double the size that you see in the bottom left-hand corner, because when you die, the empty vessel just poops out of whatever shell they were wearing and has a couple of seconds to leap back in before enemies start gunning for your soft, pale belly. If you get caught while running back to your shell, you'll die in 1 hit, and you only get 1 chance at this. If your HP hits 0 again after jumping back into your shell, it's game over. Just like most Souls-likes, there's penance for failing these runs to your shells, and they're harder than they sound despite how I've just described it. You lose your tar and glimpses upon death, and if you can't regain your shell, they're gone forever. However, as a small blessing, the game leaves your shell in the same spot where you died, uniquely solidified in the death pose you perished in. Grabbing the shell refills your health bar to 100%, meaning that realistically, you can have 3 HP bars from this point on, making it a key strategy with boss fights. All too often I'd face off against a boss knowing that I was going to die the first time, but using this opportunity to read their patterns and prepare for the real fight the next time around. Death is part of your dungeon strategy too. Despite the dungeons being quite small, without enemies you could run through the first 2 in under a minute, traversing through them will take you quite a while due to the tough fights ahead and finding your way through the shortcuts and caves. As a result, I'd often fight my way through the first half of the dungeon, get my ass handed to me, and then charge back through to where my shell remained to heal myself and effectively use it as a checkpoint. Honestly, without this system, the dungeon runs would have been way more tedious, what with how difficult I initially found the combat system, but it's a saving grace, enhancing my experience tenfold rather than hindering it. And it doesn't hurt that every boss has a Sester Janessa checkpoint 3 feet away. On that note, we've reached the Enslaved Grishner, who's simply a bigger version of our first boss, but with a metal cage stuck to its head and occasional icicles dropping from the ground. I know that people in the beta had trouble with this boss, but I kicked its ass on the first go through in both of my playthroughs, so I guess that play conditioning has really done its job. But we can't celebrate for long because the cavern behind us has collapsed, and we're now stuck down here.
None of you seem to understand. I'm not locked in here with you. You're locked in here with me!
Reaching Tarsus, the first martyr, we're faced with this open cavern. Frozen figures are reaching out towards where Tarsus waits. Under our feet, dark silhouettes, almost soul-like, swim in the same direction. Being the first martyr, I believe it's Tarsus who has written these journal entries for us to follow, but it may very well be Solomon, one of our heroes, as I've seen others theorize. To quote from the game, "The first martyr gave neither blood nor body. No, he gave up so much more to preserve our faith. He gave his living memory, all that he knew, all that he glimpsed, sealed within the ice. As it thaws, open your mouth and harden your heart. Receive his gift. Remember what came before." I've seen a lot of rage about Tarsus online, but honestly I don't get the hate. I had a lot of fun with Tarsus. He's speedier than Imrod by far, and as the post on screen says, he does lose your lock-on a little too much. However, in contrast to Imrod, Tarsus is much more parryable. Is parryable a word? I used to be an English teacher, I should know this. Just one sec. Well, it's a word now. Praise the parry! Leaving Tarsus to the ground gave me my most ashamed moment of the whole game. Oh, good night, sweet prince. Yeah, god damn it. Fool me once, shame on you, but fool me twice, well, shut up. The fact Tarsus has a second phase shouldn't have taken me by surprise, but it really genuinely did. This phase lets us use Harden in a new way though. See this move? Tarsus summons icicles to trap us, meaning in any other battle we'd be stuck, waiting for this bloody popsicle to get a free hit in. But if you time Harden just right, you can turn Tarsus's cockiness against him and dodge through the attack. When I discovered this, the battle took a new turn. Between this and my parry mechanic, Tarsus didn't stand a chance. A great boss to finish off a brilliant dungeon. And then, stealing the gland, the darkness descends and, just like at the end of the Shrine of Ash, we have to desperately dash our way back to the entrance with wraiths now batting at us. Yeesh, someone really doesn't want us to steal these glands. Before we tackle our last dungeon, there are a few matters to clean up first. We still have 2 heroes to find and a weapon to add to our repertoire. Now, if you've been watching the footage on screen, you might notice that I may have sort of stumbled across Aerodrum the Venerable and the hammer before diving into the Crypt of Martyrs, but just act like you didn't see that. We find Aerodrum at the entrance to the Eternal Narthex, collapsed up against one of these toppled ivory obelisks. From what I can gather, he fought on behalf of one of the cults we've been exposed to over the course of the game, reluctantly signing himself up to the Ovate, one of the gods of this world. I've seen some ridiculous claims that Aerodrum is the game's easy mode because he's a tank and has a large health pool.
Well, let me introduce Aerodrum the Venerable. This shell class can make the game quite a bit easier in a way, since this guy can take a huge beating thanks to his maxed out durability stat.
But anybody who argues this misses the teeny tiny itty bitty stamina bar at the bottom. You can get like 2 swings out of the Martyr's blade with this thing, meaning that if you're fighting with Aerodrum, you'll need to use the hammer and chisel to hold your own. Now that we've got Aerodrum, let's go find our final hero, Tial the Acolyte. This will also give me a great opportunity to talk about the atmosphere of Fulgrim. The 3 dungeons we explore do feel steeped in history, but it's hard not to get a sense that they're levels designed for a game rather than parts of the world which have organically evolved over time. Fulgrim, in contrast to that, feels very natural. The wiki reads, "The tower is all that remains, a vestige of the fledgling race and its progenitor. It holds only a memory of the forefather and his flock. The wilds encroach, grasping at the hidden names, eroding mantras once etched in stone. And exploring the winding swamp, you'll see the sense of civilization lost to time. You'll often stumble across small and large-scale bandit camps relaxing by a boiling pot. Looting these will commonly give us food items to heal with. The distinct strum of a lute is the only music we'll really hear throughout our adventure, and luckily Fulgrim is littered with a few Jimi Hendrix wannabes. Traps litter the dense foliage, and I found myself stuck in these too many times to count. I'm not sure if the bandits laid these traps to catch adventurers like us, or something much bigger like the Grishna. The limitations of Mortal Shell's design become quite apparent after the 17th tunnel you crawl through. Even Fulgrim, as large as it is, needs to use tunnels to hide brief loading screens and give the illusion that the area is more open than it really is, much like Final Fantasy VII's remake, where squeezable gaps were used instead. I don't mind this too much though, as much as we'll never get a shocking "oh my god, I'm here" moment. The scope of the game provides enough shortcuts that chugging from one end of the map to another never feels egregiously long. And hey, I'd rather crawl through a tunnel than sit through one of these again. Something else I want to take the time to discuss here is the way Mortal Shell uses its items. One of the most creative things about the game is that you must use an item in order to find out what it does, and boosting your familiarity with that item increases its effectiveness, reveals some lore, or could even change its use. For example, the tar spore mushrooms will slightly poison you for the first few uses, but ultimately will act as an antidote once your familiarity with them has improved. It's a smart way to provide a new level of depth to consumables, especially considering Mortal Shell has, in all, perhaps 30 items in the whole game. I'm not sure if it's a system which would work for Souls-likes which span 30 to 40 hours with hundreds of consumables, but for a game of this length, it's a great way to absorb you into the world. One thing which will bother you in the early hours, or at least it did me, are healing items. I told you we'd return to this. At first glance, it looks like Mortal Shell only provides a couple of healing items, welt caps, baguettes, and roasted rats, which you'll commonly find in bandit camps. They heal you a little bit, and slowly, taking about 60 seconds in the welt caps case to provide only 30 HP. Welt caps will grow around the world and regenerate on a timer, but realistically, by this point in the game that we're at, preparing for the final dungeon, I stopped wasting my time by farming them. Mortal Shell already provides you with a healing system in the form of the shell mechanic, remember? Getting knocked out of your shell and reclaiming it provides you with a full HP boost.
But like during the boss battle, to actually have the benefits of the healing come into effect, I had to play keep away for a while. And so it's like, okay, well, the healing is directly tying into my strategy, which I liked.
It almost feels like Cold Symmetry reluctantly muttered, "Fine, you want healing items? Have them," before dotting the world with welt caps. But to complain about this, I find, is to miss the point. You're not supposed to rely on consumables. You're supposed to use harden, parry, or shells to regain your health. Your focus shouldn't be in retreating and glugging a potion down your gullet. It should be on using your combat strategy to your advantage. Anyway, to unlock TL, we have to battle an optional boss, Ven Noctivagu. But if you've waited as long as I have to nab him, this ferrety little demon should give you no trouble at all. He's just like his pals, which spawn when the dark fog covers Fulgrim post-dungeon. Smashing him provides us with everyone's favourite speedy boy. TL is the fast hero. He has a huge stamina bar but a meek health pool, meaning you have to be at the top of your game to make the most of him. His dodge ability provides extra iframes as well, turning to smoke as he dodges out of the way of an enemy. The key to making him work is focus. You can be greedy with TL, but if you mistime a dodge or harden, a boss can take you down in just a couple of hits. Wearing his face when returning to Sester Janessa provided me with one of my favourite little interactions of the game. See, TL was once Janessa's lover, and she mournfully recognises him when you return to her. I audibly awed when this happened. It also explains why Janessa's been so sexually frustrated for the whole game, and even the memory of TL has her all hot and bothered, even if he is a skeleton now.
Come closer. It's a simple pleasure to glimpse my beloved. Even if he's truly gone, some part of him remains with you. A small consolation, but I shall accept this mercy.
Would it please your withered lips to taste my gifts once again?
Alright, so we've collected all of our shells, conquered 2 dungeons, and it just leaves the Eternal Narthex, by far the most breathtaking area of the game. As the wiki says, these huge towering obelisks crumble as quickly as they're rebuilt, and looking at the enemy types, this seems to be the home of the Cesters. Let's rewind ever so slightly though, and face against Hadern for one final battle in an effort to claim the hammer and chisel, by far my favourite weapon in the game for their speed. I took Hadern down on the first try in this fight. He's fast, but I had upgraded my hallowed sword by this point that each blow was taking off about 1/10 of his health. Getting the hammer and chisel, and how I clung to it like a crystal rose for the rest of the game, made me realise that, for the sake of balancing, the hallowed sword's speed should have been a tad faster so there wasn't such a wide berth between this weapon and the agility of the others. Charging into a battle and staggering an enemy to get some free hits in, hardening and then finishing them off became my core strategy for Eternal Narthex, and I have the hammer to thank. Say goodbye to Hadern, everyone. That's the last time we'll see him. Farewell, old friend. We hardly knew ye. The Eternal Narthex looks like it's collapsing in on itself. Our main task here is to manoeuvre our way through 3 new enemies and this towering obstacle course of columns, wide open spaces and tight corridors. Ultimately, we have to flip 3 switches to open this massive door and enter the temple ahead. Mortal Shell's lighting engine gets to finally show off what it can do, contrasting the gloomy mist we've trudged through in Fulgrim with these beautiful golden colours. The skybox is glowing. Radiant light is cast down on us from above, giving a real sense of marching onwards to a conclusive godlike power. There are ambushes here, but they're nothing like what we faced in the Shrine of Ash. Often, we have to combat agile Cesters, clad in popping red, while their comrades blast at us with rapid-fire ballistics out of the corner of our eye. They're mostly manageable because we've unlocked Aerodrum, who can just tank enemies, and our weapon has been leveled up so we can take them down in just a couple of hits. The real challenge here isn't necessarily the combat, but finding our way through this open space, and, as always with Souls-likes, gravity. The towering, faceless clerics steadily march at us from a distance, so we often need to take out the Cesters quickly before they reach us. The sound of their ivory hammers clanking against the ground is absolutely terrifying. Instead of the tunnels and crawl spaces we've previously used, there are teleportation points we have to use to get around, leading to a discombobulating feeling well in touch with the ambience of the dungeon. Again, beautifully, the level design is making us feel that oppressive atmosphere of the world. However, unfortunately, this final dungeon is where a couple of the technical issues reared their ugly heads. Mortal Shell isn't exactly broken, in fact all of its systems work together beautifully, but on a couple of occasions throughout my playthrough I found enemies would freeze and turn to stone themselves, taking all of my attacks but not dying, just dissolving like candy floss in a raccoon's hands. Oh no! Oh, look at his little face! Oh, that's the saddest thing I've ever seen! This is pretty inconsequential stuff. It doesn't break the game and only happened a couple of times on both of my playthroughs, but the Eternal Narthex, in all of its splendour, seems to also be putting quite a bit of pressure on the engine. We find some low-res textures, which again is fine, nothing to write home about, but the slightly glitchy edges became a real sore point for me. You have to wind your way up collapse obelisks, sometimes presented with the option of making a difficult jump to circumvent some enemies, but sometimes I'd wander down a teensy little ledge and turn around to realise I can't go back up. I get the idea here, it's to force you to progress. The Eternal Narthex is massive and this funnels you through simple paths to prevent you from getting lost. But it just led to a paranoid mistrust of tiny ledges, unsure if this was a path I could return from. It would have made much more sense to make these ledges simply higher to remove that distrust. Moving into the dim gate, the Eternal Narthex begins to drip with even more atmosphere. Towering religious statues look down on us from above, and enemies become even more dense. Finding Sister Janessa, she tells us,
Don't fret. It is not your mind unraveling, but our world. Our senses betray us, allowing us to believe our surroundings are immutable, even knowable. But nothing is certain within the Sanctum of the Revered. A curious blessing. My old kin do not shy away from these troubling inconsistencies. Instead, they welcome and embrace them. They worship at the feet of those rapturously twisted and reborn. So, calm yourself and take a sip.
It seems appropriate then that we're playing as Aerodrum in the footage you see, because I find his story is most relevant to this dungeon. He talks of becoming an executioner for the cult, which seemed to reside here, blindly murdering those the cult deemed impure. Tragically-ish, his story ended when the cult turned against him for not fully absorbing its doctrine, and this is why we found his body outside the entrance. Climbing towards the top, the platforms get skinnier and much more difficult to cross. Thin staircases wind their way up as we try to reach the towers in the sky. We also find the most affecting of Mortal Shell shortcuts, a cheeky lift which connects the base of the tower to the top of it. The tense encounters trying to navigate these thin platforms while battling the Sisters leads to a palpable sense that indeed this is the most difficult quote-unquote dungeon of the three. Reaching the archives, we find rambling texts by the devout, and Sister Janessa gives us a strange, meta piece of lore.
Once I was in awe of the knowledge contained here. But it was a fool's errand to try to catalog the contents of this library. The devout keep searching, endlessly hunting for a revelation, even as they're surrounded by madness. Keep your eyes ahead, foundling. Do not stray among the teetering stacks. You'll only delay the inevitable.
Are Cold Symmetry mocking us? Souls-like lovers, the devout, search through the darkness, delaying our next inevitable death, searching for that special piece of lore which will let this all make sense? Also, Sister Janessa's huge here. Why? Is this her true form? Have we just been seeing a projection? It would explain how she seems to pop up when we need her most, but is it a physical projection? Because she clearly had a sexual relationship with TL, and she holds a chalice which we can drink from, and this does seem to be where the Sisters and Brothers live, but we're faced with confusing tablets, and what does this even mean? I don't know what's going on. What's the lore? Help, Redgrave, help! If you fully level up your hero, she becomes a merchant, showing that glimpses and tar are quite plentiful, encouraging us to fully customize all of our shells, not just focus on one. You use glimpses to buy from her, but she sells glimpses of affection to you, presumably because she has many fond memories of her time with TL, but why would anyone buy these? It costs 6 to purchase, and it will only give you 5 glimpses when consumed. Weird. Approaching the chalice, ready for our last dungeon boss, I pull it out intending to drink, and Mortal Shell slaps us with its first, and only, to be fair, dick move. Plunging to the level below, boom, there goes a third of our health. Unless you're a smart cookie and instinctively jam L2 to harden, making you do a badass hero pose.
Woo! Superhero landing! Yeah, that's really hard on your knees.
Crucix the Twiceborn is appropriately a tough boss fight, and I love his design with his conjoined twin look. I love the little gesture his wee pal does, indicating towards us and signalling, let's kill this guy. The enemies we fought up until now have all been designed around preparing us for Crucix better than any other dungeon. The ballistic cesters we battled have keyed us into dodging these crossbow bolts. Crucix's wide, powerful attacks are similar to the faceless clerics we struck down on our way to him. The first phase isn't too tricky, but when he dies, we're faced with this. Aw, his wee pal died. I mean, I was ready for the second phase this time, you're not going to trick me this time, game, but damn, I almost feel bad now. And I can't be the only one who felt a little sick at the attached camera angle here, right? Crucix flies into a rage on his second phase, and it's here where we find the real challenge. He has lengthy, swift combos which, if you get stuck in, can flip you around like a pancake. You can't stagger him out of these combos either, so even as Aerodrum, you can't just tank his hits and power through. Defeating him, we march on and steal our final gland. The darkness descends once more and we have to escape, just like the previous 2 dungeons. Except this journey is much longer. Even with the shortcuts, some of the teleporters are now blocked, and the map is suddenly littered with enemies. The worst bit, by far, is getting stuck in this ridiculous section where like 20 ballistic cesters just start firing their rapid fire guns here. Unless you're playing as TL, I don't know how anyone can get through this without slashing their health pool. Not cool. Emerging into Fulgrim, we stagger back to the tower and the Dark Father. The fog is even more deadly, and the demonic enemies follow you all the way through the swamp, so you should either be ready for a long fight, or I hope you know Fulgrim like the back of your hand by now. Worse yet, it seems we can't get rid of the fog either. Speaking to the Dark Father, we're faced with a strange choice. Either try to take the gland back from him after his villain turn, or happily let him gobble it up. Either way, it doesn't impact the end of the game. I don't really know why Mortal Shell provided us with this choice. If anybody knows of a clear difference in outcomes, please let me know. Regardless, it turns out the Dark Father has been manipulating us this whole time. Who could have seen that coming? Absorbing the glands in an effort to ascend, meaning if we want to truly complete the game, we've got to take him down.
It's all wrong. The visions have dissolved into darkness. There is no ascension. Only an endless abyss, growing deeper and deeper as I stretch my wings uselessly. I've fallen into a sea of shadows. I remember warmth and light, but even that is fading. The visions weren't for me. They were for you. Are you not meant for this blighted place after all? But why should you get to escape, while the rest of us remain mired in this miserable pit? It's senseless, this injustice. If I can't ascend, neither will you.
his wee flap. Now that's the saddest thing I've ever seen. The Dark Father's a really cool boss fight, but it's not necessarily my favourite moment of the game. That honour most definitely goes to Crucix. It may have been just because of time constraints, but I don't mind that we're in the same boss arena as the Hadern battles. It ties a neat bow onto the end of the game, making it feel self-contained. Seeing the Unchained's full form, it lends credence that the coffins we saw in the Crypt of Martyrs appear to be an ancient race, perhaps? Perhaps they mutilated themselves like this is an effort to fly like he does? The Unchained is quite unique too. His massive size is bigger than anything else we've battled so far, and the rolling wave attack, while a total pain in the arse, means we have to battle the level design as well as him. He has a high health pool, but his attacks don't do too much damage, so it feels like a fair fight, though I admit, I've only ever beaten him using Aerodrum. What isn't fair, and is definitely the game's greatest sin, is how he spawns standard foes. I get the idea, we're battling blackened, single-hit, empty vessels like you can become in the game's so-called hard mode, but it doesn't matter how much I love a game, I hate when a boss spawns lesser enemies. It's just lazy game design. The Unchained would probably be a step higher in my boss ranking if we just had to take him on one-on-one. Unfortunately, we also have to battle the camera here as well. Normally I'd recommend that you don't lock on to the Unchained in this battle as it wonks the camera all over the place, but Mortal Shell's standard angle is always facing slightly down, so you've got a problem there as well. The purpose here is obviously to draw attention to the traps littered throughout Fulgrim, but with the Unchained leaping about so much, it can be a little bit irritating not being able to see his frame. Still, it's not as much of an issue as some others, cough, ebriatus, cough. Despite being immersion breaking, I really appreciate that the game explicitly tells us that if we choose to steal the Dark Father's gland, we'll begin New Game Plus. As we swipe it from him, we are met with a typically obscure ending. Our vessel floats up into the air and then whoosh, off we go. Although we all know that's the bad ending, the good ending is becoming besties for life with the Brigand NPC in Fulgrim, chilling by the fireside, eating rats and playing the lute until the end of time. God, I didn't even talk about how great the loot is, but for a 15-hour game, this video is already over an hour, so I think it's best to leave it here. Mortal Shell is the game 2020 needed. It's been such a slow, polarising year, and jumping into just a good, well-crafted homage to the Souls-like genre felt like a hot shower at the end of a long day. And after the Avengers beta, I needed this. I can't wait to see what Cold Symmetry comes out with next, but until then, don't mind me. I'll just be slaughtering some brigands and chatting to a frog about music.
Come on then. Take a sit and have a drink. We can watch life pass on by.
Thanks for watching. Despite the videos already up, this isn't meant to be a Soulsborne channel, which will become clear with my next critique, which will of course be on Marvel's Avengers, because, oh boy, if the final game is anything like the beta, I'm going to have some words with Crystal Dynamics. If you liked this video, maybe you'd like my Bloodborne critique, and even though I've already got my next 2 videos lined up, subscribe to the channel and follow my Twitter to vote on which games I tackle. Take care.